Hi everybody, we're back with another video on what I'm trying to do with another book that I want to share for my initiative. So the name of this initiative, I called it Raisinsouls. So I also created an Instagram for this whole thing called Raisinsouls. And the title is a combination of two pieces of notable African-American literature. Raisin came from A Raisin in the Sun from Lorraine Hansberry, and Souls came from The Souls of Black Folk from W.E.B. DuBois, which is the text that I'm going to be sharing for today's video. And for those who don't know, yesterday was Juneteenth, which is a very important holiday to commemorate the end of American chattel slavery, and the last of the slaves got the news that they were emancipated in Galveston, Texas. So happy belated Juneteenth to any Black Americans that are celebrating this independence that we have. And I think The Souls of Black Folk from W.E.B. Du Bois is a perfect text. So for those who don't know, W.E.B. Du Bois, aka William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, he's a notable sociologist, he's a teacher, and also a civil rights activist. He founded the NAACP, and he got a lot of speeches, a lot of research, and anything pertaining to race in the United States. So The Souls of Black Folk is like the most notable of his work. I know a lot of African American studies programs, they share The Souls of Black Folk, and you had to heard of W.E.B. Du Bois if you ever taken an African American studies class. So I think this is like the perfect one to start off. So Chapter 1 is of our spiritual strivings. So this is when Du Bois introduced the concept of the racial veil. So the racial veil is simply black skin. So pretty much how society puts these conditions because of the color of your skin, and that's the racial veil. And he also coined this term called double consciousness, which is pretty much giving space to how African Americans navigate the United States with the Black identity and the identity of being in the United States. So being a citizen of the United States. So pretty much having to this like identity crisis of living in a society that historically has put violence and injustice and any marginalization to you. So that is what is very popularized out of his book. And Du Bois talked about discrimination that has occurred after slavery. So that pretty much is like what he was talking about throughout the whole book. Like, even though slavery as we knew today is abolished, there's still these injustices that Black Americans have to go through. And he talked about like there's this illusion of freedom because of the Emancipation Proclamation, that you're free, but you still face discriminations in employment and education and any other institutions that probably would have make you a functional member of society. So he talked about the 15th Amendment and how it got in like the paradox that came within it. And I highlighted quotes that probably would have stood out to me and probably would have explained even further what he's gone to, and I did. And he said, for the first time, he sought to analyze the burden, he meaning the Negro. So it's like patriarchal, the language that he has. And he bore upon his back that dead weight of social degradation, partly masked behind a half-named Negro problem. So how subliminal racism is. He felt his poverty without a cent, without a home, without land, tools, or savings. he had entered into competition with rich, landed, skilled neighbors. So he talked about how white people had 100 years of a head start and had all these benefits and privileges being in the United States, and black people are still in the bottom. Like there's no head start for them. So that's pretty much the gist of what he was talking about in chapter 1. So chapter 2 of The Dawn of Freedom goes into like the truth about the Civil War and what it was about. So everyone who knows about the truth, it's for economic reasons why they freed the slaves, not for moral reasons. That's why Lincoln freed the slaves. And he talked about the formation of this government agency called the Freedmen's Bureau, which was established to handle slaves after the Civil War, how to what can we do to manage these slaves, and that you can parallel this to how undocumented immigrants are treated in the United States, because it's like all these organizations that are put up to take care of problems that come with being an immigrant, and especially undocumented, but there's like no guaranteed protections for it. So for example, DACA, it's like this program that is held for undocumented children, but doesn't really give them protections to be documented and be a citizen of the United States. And that's how I think it's literally how emancipated black people are. Like there's fugitive slaves, like they come to slaves that come from the South go to the North to seek political asylum or something like that of sort. And then there was a lot of government action to how to accompany people that are free, and there were a lot of conferences and bills that were discussed. And it was like so much filibustering. Like it took them so long to come up with like a concrete bill to handle emancipated slaves. And then there came the Emancipation Proclamation, which as we know today, freed the slaves. And then there's these regulations that the Bureau has to go through to provide relief to freedmen. So there's funding of HBCUs, for example. So a lot of HBCUs were founded among while the Freedmen's Bureau was going on. And then the Freedmen's Bureau got into a place where businesses and corporations, they got contracts with the Freedmen's Bureau. So there was a lot of corruption that the Freedmen's Bureau was going through. And it led to this. And the Freedmen's Bureau also had a bank, and it led to a crash of that bank because there was so much corruption and business interests that were going on with the Freedmen's Bureau. And a lot of the corruption was going on with black farmers and black laborers. So there was a lot of corruption that were going on with ownership of land that was going between black and white farmers. And it's literally like how landlords and tenants in apartments are treated. So the landlord is literally like the police. Like they make all these demands for certain payments for you to live in that territory. So that also leads to the convict leasing system back then that is like the earliest American prison system that we know today. And then even though there were a lot of schools that were founded upon the Freedmen's Bureau, there were a lot of unsuccesses with the judicial system, like getting representation in the jury panel, or for example. So there was a lot of injustices that were still going on to that day that the Freedmen's Bureau wasn't able to tackle. And then the end of the Freedmen's Bureau led into the establishment of the 15th Amendment. So pretty much trying to grant equality for people and not let race be a determinant of political and economic power. And even though the 15th Amendment is still like a thing, there's still this persistence of a racial caste system. So black people are still like in the bottom, even with the 15th Amendment, and white people are still in the top. Like they get to be the CEOs, the leaders. So there's more centering on whiteness. And if I had any quotes that stood out of that, I did not. And chapter 3 is of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others. So for those who don't know, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, they weren't the bestest of friends. So there were some feuds that were going on. They disagreed a lot politically. And this chapter pretty much talks about the existence of a Booker T. Washington and how it got to all these white spaces. Like Booker T. Washington, he was the first black person that got invited to the White House. And the reason why he became as popular and famous as he is right now, so W. Du Bois went into Washington's appeal of industrial education and material prosperity. So there's this focus on black people still appeasing to white people even after slavery, and pretty much a respectability politics ideal that he kind of proposes. And I think it's this speech up from slavery, and it's called the Atlanta Compromise. And Du Bois had a lot of criticisms with the speech and the politics that he's trying to propose. So I know Booker T. Washington, he's against black people voting. So he don't want us to have any political power. He don't think we should have civil rights. He don't even think we should have higher education. So he thinks we should just still be in a place of submission to whiteness and white dominance. And Du Bois went it had an argument, and like black resistance and white supremacy is going to be political regardless. Like there's a lot of rebellions and revolts. He used Nat Turner's slave rebellion, for example, the Haitian Revolution that happened. So we can't have freedom if we're not political. So that's what Du Bois argued. And he also argued that there should be self-assertion. So black people should just go enter spaces. They should wreak havoc in white spaces and pretty much shake the table or something like that of sort. And integration and assimilation shouldn't be the focus. And I agree with that. And then Du Bois said Washington is kind of popular because his appeasing to white people it helps a cooperation between the North and the South after the Civil War and Reconstruction. So I know in Washington's speech, I think it was a whole mainstream white audience that he was giving that speech to. So I think a lot of the audience are people from the North and people from the South. And Washington has this notion that black capitalism pretty much should be a thing, even though capitalism will never save us. Like there's always going to be people in the top and people in the bottom, and people in the bottom are always going to be black people. Black people are always in the bottom of the bottom because of the top. They're always the exploiter, and people in the bottom are always the exploited. And that's pretty much why Du Bois felt that was problematic. and then Du Bois noted that black people have always given white people free labor through slavery, and we work for free. We fought in your wars. We take care of your children. There should be some entitlement and protections because we went through all of that, and we should be reciprocated any resources that you hold. And that can be an argument for reparations and stuff like that. And DuBois also felt the need for political power and civil rights and higher education. Like there's always should be these resources available for Black people. And let me see if there are any quotes that stood out to me. One of them is, to be sure, ultimate freedom and assimilation was the ideal before the leaders, but the assertion of the manhood rights of the Negro by himself was the main reliance. Pretty much Du Bois's argument that there should be a focus on freedom, liberation, and Black people be granted these spaces and resources, and not having to succumb to just simply integration and oppression. And another one is Du Bois. He said they acknowledge Mr. Washington's, they meaning white people. So white people acknowledge Mr. Washington's invaluable service in counseling, patience, and courtesy in such demands. They do not ask that ignorant Black men vote when ignorant whites are debarred, or that any reasonable restrictions in the suffrage should not be applied. They know that the low social level of the mass of the race is responsible for much discrimination against it, but they also know, and the nation knows, that relentless color prejudice is more often a cause than a result of the Negro's degradation. So he said that white people should be expected to grant resources to Black people because they benefit from the privileges that they had out of our humanity and our labor. So, and he also said they seek the abatement of this relic of barbarism and not the systematic encouragement and pampering by all agencies of social power, from the Associated Press to the Church of Christ. Pretty much talked about how racism is more than just a white person's interaction with a Black person. It's structural and systematic. Like it's even ingrained in America. So that's also like a good point that Du Bois brought up. And he also said Booker T. Washington's doctrine has tended to make the whites, North and South, shift the burden of the Negro problem to the Negro's shoulders and stand aside as critical and rather pessimistic spectators, when in fact the burden belongs to the nation, and the hands of none of us are clean if we bend not our energies to righting these great wrongs. Which I felt was very important. Like, it shouldn't be Black people's responsibility to solve racism. It should be white people's and the United States responsibility to solve racism. Y'all came up with racism. Y'all built this problem of racism. It should be y'all's responsibility to fix it. There should be accountability and a reckoning of what y'all did to the Black communities. Which I can't say anything. What more can you say? And then chapter 4 is of the meaning of progress. So this is Du Bois talking about his experience as a teacher. He was teaching when he was in Fisk University. So he was in this Black community. He went into this Black school. He was teaching there. And his living arrangements, he was living with his Black family, and he was talking about the sense of community he got out of living in that home with that family. He talked about this girl named Josie, who I think was also a student at Fisk, so that's how he was able to make the connections. And he talked about when he was going into the Black schoolhouse, how insufficient and the harsh conditions that they had to endure. Like, it's very unfortunate. Like, it's a log hunt. Like, the schoolhouse is made out of logs, and the chairs that the students were sitting in, they had no backs to support them, so they had no support when they were sitting, and there wasn't a lot of furniture. I don't know if Du Bois even had a desk when he has to grade papers and evaluate assignments that he gave the students. And he talked about even when they lived in these harsh conditions, how important it has to have that sense of community to forget that you're even living in a racist society. And he took the students to a lot of trips to the farms that were in near around Fisk in Tennessee. And he also talked about during his years of teaching how the students turned out. A lot of them went into like good professions. A lot of them went into teachers. A lot of them went into law or anything, civil rights focus, and a lot of them they went into pretty much a lot of lower paying jobs, because when you're in a racist society, like there's no guarantee of what profession you're going to go into. And that's pretty much the gist of chapter 4. Let me see if I got any quotes from that, and I do not. And chapter 5 is Of the Wings of Atlanta, and he spelled Atlanta with an A after the T, so it's Atlanta. And if there's anyone in the comments that can explain why that is. And I know there's this idea that some people in the Black communities envision Atlanta, Georgia as like this Black utopia. Like you can get any sort of job if you're Black in Atlanta. And he kind of mimicked those sentiments a lot in this chapter. He talked about the aspirations and attachment to Atlanta, because Atlanta also has like a lot of history with the cotton economy during slavery. And he talked about this self-realization and envisioning freedom beyond the racial veil. So what would freedom look like without the racial veil? So what can we do to envision a society where race doesn't interfere with our interactions? And then he talked a lot about, then he went into a little bit of education in this quote. The riddle of existence is the college curriculum that was laid before the pharaohs, that was taught in the globes of Plato, that formed the trivium and quadrivium, and is today laid before the freedmen's sons by Atlanta University. And this course of study will not change. Its methods will grow more deft and effectual, its content richer by toil of scholar and sight of seer. But the true college will ever have one goal, not to earn meat, but to know the end and aim of that life which meat nourishes. So it's literally redefining education as we know it. How do we look into education as more than just thinking education will give us to a place of privilege or access and resources? How do we actually liberate ourselves when we're educated? How are we valued through our humanity and moralities when we go through the education system, which has a lot of work to do. Like a lot of things that are taught in the education system is not like true history and stuff like that. So that's even in college, like history can be whitewashed. You can revise history. Like history is written by the victors. So that you have to figure out how to go into the truth and actually get into like the realistic intentions that are happening throughout the history of society. And he also went into how Black people went into fields of go from preachers and teachers to farmers, gardeners, porters, artisans, and businessmen. How we expand our horizons in these industries. So pretty much go not into narrow boxes that white society put us in, and how we need Black people in spaces, not just preaching and teaching, and how we have to contribute to the economy and stuff like that. So it's like how the importance of all these other fields. And then he said, like, there should be this focus on living instead of existing. There should be this idea of living and learning while you're in society. How are you going to navigate through society and be productive in it? Like, what are you contributing to society that will benefit not just you, but all people? And he talked about the need for scholars and blacksmiths. So how I interpret it is that there's this need for education through the scholars and the need from material resources from blacksmiths. So it's important that Black people contribute to education and resources. How that all that should be intermingled when we're talking about community development. And let me see if there's another quote that stood out to me. Yeah, this quote was so good. He said, "The worker must work for the glory of his handiwork, not simply for pay. The thinker must think for the truth, not for fame. And all this is gained only by human strife and longing, by ceaseless training and education, by founding right on righteousness and truth on the unhampered search for truth, by founding the common school on the university and the industrial school on the common school, and weaving thus a system, not a distortion, and bringing a birth, not an abortion." So he's like proposing a pretty much a system where people are valued not just through their labor. Like you should not just be doing things just for the sake of doing it. What are you learning from the things that you're doing? And that's like the importance of education. What knowledge are you gaining, and how are you applying the concepts that you're gaining from the knowledge that you collected? And then chapter 6 is of the training of Black men. So this is when he talked about the inequities in Black schools and white schools, especially during and after Reconstruction, how there's these inequitable funding in HBCUs to PWIs. So, like, even after the Civil War, you're literally giving crumbs to HBCUs when you just freed slaves. So that makes no sense. And he talked about the mistreatment of Black teachers. So when integration was happening in a lot of schools, and then came Brown versus Board of Education, a lot of Black teachers were laid off because they saw the Brown versus Board of Education. It's just solely integration. So just put Black students with white students. But what about funding for the schools that Black people were put into before they were integrated with the white kids? So that DuBois also noted attention to that. And he talked about after the Civil War, Black people immediately want to be educated. Like, they went into colleges and universities and any type of school so they can gain knowledge to the society that they live in, what to do with that knowledge, what careers they can get out of that knowledge. And he talked about the trends and occupations that they went into. Yeah, one of the quotes he said, "Progress in human affairs is more often a pull than a push, surging forward of the exceptional man and the lifting of his duller brethren slowly and painfully to his vantage ground." So he talked about how little valued education is. Like, there needs to be a strong investment in education, and it should not be treated as a luxury. It should be a human right, and everyone should have access to education. And he also talked about the mistreatment of Black teachers in this quote. He said, "The teachers in these institutions came not to keep the Negroes in their place, but to raise them out of the defilement of the places where slavery had wallowed them." So how do we liberate ourselves from mental slavery and stuff like that through our education system? How are we educated out of our oppression? And he also talked about how we should redefine education and how to keep Blacks from oppression through education. And I think that's all from that. Yeah, he also said, and above our modern socialism and out of the worship of the mass must persist and evolve the higher individualism which the centers of culture protect. There must come a loftier respect for the sovereign human soul that seeks to know itself and the world about it, that seeks a freedom for expansion and self-development, that will love and hate and labor in its own way, untrammeled alike by old and new. Such souls aforetime have inspired and guided worlds, and if we be not wholly bewitched by our Rheingold, they shall again. So he's talking about the importance of investing in community development through that quote. Like, we should not just focus on ourselves. We should be concerned and unselfish and care for other people, not just ourselves. We should care for our family members, our friends, anyone that are in our community, because we're all going to go through the same system and we should have all the same resources. There are people born into wealth and there are people born into poverty, and there should be, that's the society we live in. Like, it makes no sense. And that's pretty much it for that chapter. And chapter 7 is of the black belt. So for those who don't know about what the black belt is, it's this area from Macon, Georgia to Albany, Georgia. And it's a very high cotton economic industry that was in that part of Atlanta. And during slavery, and he talked about how before slavery, it used to be territory of the Cherokee Nation. So he talked about the genocide that happened to indigenous Native Americans and Indian people, and how it became the society it is today. And he's talking about how, like, the cotton economy in the Black Belt was so strong that it used to be called the Cotton Kingdom in the Egypt of the Confederacy. Like, it's literally any type of cotton you can find, you'll find in the Black Belt. And after the Civil War, it was a lot of ruins. So the cotton economy, it also failed. It became deindustrialized. And he talked about, like, how there was no, like, exhibits or anything because it was literally like a museum. The way it was left, like, there was no fences or anything. It was just there. Like, no one did anything about it to display it or something like that. And then he talked about also the convict labor of black tenants, so like black farmers and black laborers, how they have to work for white landowners and white landlords. So he talked about sharecropping and all that stuff, and he talked about the troubles that black farmers had to do to own land. And then it became so hard that white landlords and landowners, they're just so difficult that they let Russian Jews take over those lands. So there was some gentrification that you can say of used to be black farms. And I don't think anyone knows, like, how important black farmers are. Like, they put a lot of care and love and focus on what the food that they grow should go into black people's stomachs and stuff like that. There's a lot of food security when it comes to black farmers. They create community gardens. They fight a lot of oppression through land ownership, and because there was no need for there was a lack of focus on reparations, black farmers took it upon themselves to try to own lands. And he pretty much talked about the hardships that come with that. And were there any quotes that stuck out to me in that chapter? No. And then the next chapter, chapter 8, is of the quest of the Golden Fleece. So he talked about rural communities specifically, so the countryside and stuff like that, how racism is going in that part of the United States. And he talked about it was a lot of housing discrimination, lack of access to employment and education. And he talked about the black people that fought in the Civil War. There was not a lot of protections for them. Like we literally talked about for Booker T. Washington, like we fought in your wars and you not given any protections to us. Like you could talk about black people that even fought in World War II and the Vietnam War, how they come back from those wars to the United States and how they were mistreated. Like a lot of black veterans, they didn't get the GI Bill and stuff like that. So I found that very relevant. And DuBois talked about how marriage worked as we know it. So for those who don't know, a lot of black marriages, they were officiated in the black churches and stuff like that. But before black churches became the way they were, marriages were officiated and arranged by overseers and slave owners. So you can be married to someone and you're not even in love with that person. It's just the landowner and the slave master told you to marry that person. So it was very compulsory. It was very forced. There was a lot of coercion that went into it. That way they can produce more black children and they become black slaves. So that's very it's very hard to read that. And then DuBois went into how merchants were exploiting and corrupting black farmers, and there was a lot of corruptions with the mortgages that they give black farmers. So it's literally how landlords and apartments treat their tenants and stuff like that. Like it's literally a business, and they make all these charges to things that don't even make sense. Like you made the wrong crop or something for me. All of a sudden, I don't like this crop. I need to pay you more. I need to charge you even more money than I charged you before. And then let me this quote. It talked about the debt that black tenant families were going through. And he talked about the cotton economy and how it became deindustrialized in 1898. So this paragraph, he said, in the year of low-priced cotton, 1898, out of 300 tenant families, 175 ended their year's work in debt. So the majority of black tenant families, they were in debt. 300 families, 175 were in debt in the extent of $14,000. So that talks about the corruption, the racism, and exploitation. And he said 50 cleared nothing, and the remaining 75 made a total profit of $1,600. So you can literally talk about how redlining and how this is like literally the same system redlining is operating under. And isn't it? Yeah, he then talked about the economic devastation and the further discrimination and how it leads to the prison system, because a lot of people are in debt. They're criminalized. So that leads into the cycle of incarceration. And then he reinforced the difficulties of ownership of lands, how black people, there was no knowledge or no training on how to own lands. They had to figure out for themselves, and that there's no head start because there's no reparations. There's no stimulus or protection granted to people to own lands. And then chapter 9 is of the sons of master and man. So he went into the socialization of racisms through institutions and relationships. So how racism literally manifests within churches, schools, markets, literally policies, prison systems, and stuff of that sort. And he also talked about you can be the nicest white person that you think you are, but how many black friends do you have? How many black history have you seek to know about? Have you held white people accountable for their racism? So that's literally what he talks about when there's a socialization of racism. And then he went into a critique of capitalism on it's 2 paragraphs. He gave lengthy of critiques of capitalism. He said it was the duty of someone to see that these working men were not left alone and unguided, without capital, without land, without skill, without economic organization, without even the bald protection of land, of law, order, and decency, left in a great land, not to settle down to slow and careful internal development, but destined to be thrown almost immediately into relentless and sharp competition with the best of modern working men under an economic system where every participant is fighting for himself and too often utterly regardless of the rights or welfare of his neighbor. So he's talking about the racialization that goes within capitalism. Black people are always going to be in the bottom of American capitalism. Like, black people can't benefit from capitalism at all. Like, there's always going to be a black person exploited under this system. And there's no head start because white people have been exploiting our labor for hundreds of years. And then he also said, under such a system, all labor is bound to suffer. So you never will win under capitalism. Your community will never win under capitalism. And he said, even the white laborers are not yet intelligent, thrifty, and well-trained enough to maintain themselves against the powerful inroads of organized capital. So he talked about how white people, even they get exploited from capitalism. Like, the majority of white people are poor in the United States because there's more white people. And the results among them even are long hours of toil. Talk about the exploitation that goes within of employment, low wages, child labor, and lack of protection against usury and cheating. But among the black laborers, all this is aggravated because of racism. First, by a race prejudice which varies from a doubt and distrust among the best element of whites to a frenzied hatred among the worst. And secondly, it is aggravated, as I have said before, by the wretched economic heritage of the freedmen from slavery, because racial slavery. With this training, it is difficult for the freedman to learn to grasp the opportunities already open to him, and the new opportunities are seldom given him, but go by the favor to the whites. So no matter if, like, black people that work in Chick-fil-A, Walmart, Target, the majority of people that are benefiting from the money that are going into those corporations are white people. So he pretty much talked about how you'll never win under this economic system. We'll never be liberated and free from this economic system. And then he went into the need for the redistribution of power. So the richer get rich and the poor get poorer. And even under the capitalism, we should require a redistribution of resources, and the rich should give their wealth, let the people eat. People are hungry in the streets while you're and sitting comfortably in your lavish Amazon homes in Silicon Valley with drones and security guards to protect you. Like, you're the one that need to be protected when your status is protection. And then he went into how black people, we're always going to be, our issues are always going to be politicized. So he talked about the need for voting and political education. So, like, it's important, it's one way to say your vote, but it's another thing to say who are you voting for. So, like, what interests do a political candidate give you that will actually benefit you in the long run? Like, is this candidate giving you the health care that you need? Is the candidate giving you low tuition college of anything of that sort? And then, yeah, he pretty much talked, even regarding politicization, he talked about criminalization of black people after emancipation, how that's when the police system, the American police system, was formed. And he said that the inevitable result of emancipation was to increase crime and criminals. So the 13th Amendment abolished of slavery except punishment of crime. So that's when the police and the prison system was formed. He also said right here that the police system of the South was primarily designed to control slaves. So you can look up the history of policing, how it rooted in slave patrols, because there needs to be this order and control in black and low income communities. We can't put policies. There's not enough money for the policies to actually improve, rehabilitate, and educate those communities. So that's also goes into what sociologists call the culture of poverty. Like, you're unemployed and you can't afford something, so you end up into looting, you end up into vandalism, things of that sort. That's why I know this defund the police has addressed things like what Du Bois has been talking about. And another quote he said about voting, that to leave the Negro helpless and without a ballot today is to leave him not to the guidance of the best, but rather to the exploitation and debauchement of the worst. So pretty much the argument on voting, how you shouldn't let oppressors, the only voices to be heard. You should be political, and you should have that right to be political. So that's what he talked about. And then he said, but the chief problem in any community cursed with crime is not the punishment of the criminals, but the preventing of the young from being trained to crime. So how do we provide opportunities to people so they won't have to resort to crime? Like I said, when you're unemployed, you couldn't afford certain things, so you end up into looting, vandalism, and stealing. So that is what Du Bois, it's like a logic that makes sense. Like, it makes sense to it. And he also gave some statistics on the funding for education. He talked about in the state of Georgia, the white schools get $4 and the Negro $1. So pretty much the racial disparities that go within it. And Du Bois also said, in a world where it means so much to take a man by the hand and sit beside him, to look frankly into his eyes and feel his heart beating with red blood, in a world where a social cigar or a cup of tea together means more than legislative halls and magazine articles and speeches, one can imagine the consequences of the almost utter absence of such social amenities between estranged races, whose separation extends even to parks and streetcars. So I pretty much talk about systemic and structural racism and institutional racism there. And I think that's... And he also talked about the critique of colorblindness there. So how I mentioned before, like, you can be the nicest white person, but you probably still adopted racist ideologies. And chapter 10 is of the faith of the fathers. So this one talks specifically about religion and the Black church. So how important religion is to Black history. And talked about when Black people go through slavery and systematic oppression every day, the need for a safe space, and that was the Black church. And I know the Black church was like one of the first things where Black people got to be openly political. And he even talked about how the Nat Turner slave rebellion, it originated from Nat Turner having access to read and write when he was reading the Bible. And I think it was the story of Moses that motivated him to lead the rebellion because Moses freed people in Egypt. And then after that, there was a lot of establishment of Baptist and Methodist churches, like the African Methodist Episcopalian churches. And he talked about how Black people were able to turn the religion of submission that white supremacists introduced them into a religion of freedom and liberation through Nat Turner and other slave rebellions, Harriet Tubman taking slaves into the North, how all of those stories radicalized them. And I know there's like a racist justification that white supremacists put onto from the Bible. I think it was the curse of Ham. Noah's son Ham ended up becoming dark for some reason, and he's cursed. So that's how white supremacists justified racism to oppress Black people, and a lot of anthropologists back in those days, and that's how they saw Black people as primitive and savages, and that's how racism, race science, and all that, and how we conceptualize race and racism today, how that originated. And he talked about the complexities of religion, how people use religion to radicalize themselves, and how religion can be used as hypocritical compromise. So these two strands of how religion, how people can take religion. And are you focused on the ideas of my liberation, my humanity, and moral reasons, or are you just going to be nice to everyone? You have to respect people that probably won't even respect you. Are you going to be on the high road every single time that you're probably going to get harmed or violated? So he talked about like the politics that go within religion. And then chapter 11 was very personal, so it was a lot. It's called Of the Passing of the Firstborn. So he talked about the birth of his son, and his son died after 10 days. And it put DuBois in like this deep depression. And in the beginning, he talked about the birth of his son, how beautiful he was, how he was able to have a Black child. And he talked about how much he appreciates his wife and the work that she does. And he said the birth of his son, there's this shadow of the veil. Like this baby doesn't even know the oppression that's going to come to him because he's Black. And this world, and through the lens of that baby, everyone is nice. There's no evil. The baby so loves the white matron. This baby loves the Black nurse. How there's no color line, and through the lens of the baby. And this quote he said really stuck out to me. He said, he knew no color line, poor dear, and the veil through it shadowed him had not yet darkened half his sun. So this baby is in a better place, and he didn't have to succumb to racism now that he's in not in the normal society. And he talked about the baby just sees souls as souls. Like there's no racialization of the souls. And there's no classism, ableism when he faced his souls throughout his 10 days. So it's literally like a deep thinking that DuBois was going through, but I thought it was very beautiful the way he put it. And chapter 12 talks about this person, Alexander Crummell. So I got introduced to this person through this book, through this chapter. Alexander Crummell is an African nationalist. He's also a very prominent Black minister throughout the 19th century. So he and DuBois met Alexander Crummell at a commencement speech in Wilberforce University. And he talked about how, and Du Bois talked about how much he idolized Alexander Crummell. He gave him his flowers and stuff like that. He idolized this person. And he pretty much went into Crummell's background. So Crummell lived in a time where black people were still considered 3/5 of a human being, the Missouri Compromise and all that. And he actually was there when slaves got the news that they were emancipated. And he talked about his experience with racism when he got denied admission to this white school called the General Theological Seminary. So again, there are white supremacists that are in the field of religion. And then how Crummell didn't let that stop him from going to do things he loved. He grabbed his friends and family and he made his own chapel. And that is self-determination, and how inspiring that probably was to Du Bois. And he became so notable throughout the community that white people and races paid attention to him. So he got in contact with this white pastor, and then that white pastor became a false prophet to Alexander. This white pastor told him to go to a sermon where black people shouldn't be allowed to, and Alexander said nah. And then Crummell continued the work that he was doing, and then he ended up visiting Africa. And then when he visited Africa, it was literally like a pilgrimage to Mecca to him. Like he had this newfound purpose in his life. Like he feel so liberated when he visited Africa. And then he went back into the United States and got into community organizing. He went to educating young people and helping the elders and helping the sick and giving community empowerment, which I think that will motivate Du Bois, because there was a lot of parallels between their lives, because Du Bois made he organized and social movements like the Niagara movement and a lot of movements that focus on political and civil rights for African Americans. And I don't think I got a quote, but I think this was like a good story. And yeah, so chapter 13 is of the coming of John. So I'm still like learning this chapter. So Du Bois was talking about like two Johns. So I think it's like a black John and a white John, and talk about the different areas they go to. So one John was making efforts to teach at black schools, and how he succumbed to a lot of backlash from this judge. He had to get approval from this judge. And the judge gave him like some terms and conditions of what he can do when he goes to the black school. You can't teach him any radical things. And guess what? That's what that John did to the black children. And somehow the judge found out, and then immediately he closed the school. So it's literally like this struggle when you teach black students the education that they need to be educated on, and the violence that oppression goes to. It's literally like a COINTELPRO during the 1960s and 1970s that was going on during that. And the last chapter, the sorrow songs. So Du Bois talked about the importance of black music and how much we should cherish them. And Du Bois is also a historian, so he talked about the importance to archive specific black songs, because a lot of them originated during slavery, like folk songs, call and response and stuff like that. And he talked about how these songs, whenever you hear them, they're always going to be relevant to today. So like from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration to all these other injustices, those songs will be relevant. And then he talked about the history of Fisk University, how it was founded by this man named George L. White, who is a black man who from New York, and he directed a lot of choirs during his days. and he even got into Jubilee singers, and how these Jubilee singers, they went to concerts and stuff like that. Let me see. Sorry, y'all, technical difficulties, but as I said before, so DuBois talked about in this chapter the importance of Black music and that it originated from how it originated during slavery. So he talked about how some of these songs they disappeared, and they disappeared as a result of minstrel shows and caricatures of those songs. So you can think about how a lot of the rock and roll that Black people originally came from, Elvis made it like mainstream and stuff like that. You could talk about cultural appropriation and anything of that sort, and how Black music has entered into white mainstream spaces. So DuBois even pointed that out even as early as when this book was released. And he talked about the importance of how all these songs should be passed down to generations. Like it teaches like literally our history. This quote, he said, they are the music of an unhappy people, of the children of disappointment. They tell of death and suffering and unvoiced longing toward a truer world, of misty wanderings and hidden ways. And literally just talking about our struggle, and literally how we were feeling in these moments of oppression. And he talked about songs, for example, "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot" is a notable hymn that are sung in Black churches. Another is "Roll, Jordan, Roll," and a lot of that originated from how slaves felt when they were following the orders of their masters. And he talked about how these songs were formed. A lot of them are love songs, and there's a lot of biblical references in these songs, and how it gives us these feelings that we need to be empowered and freedom. And he said, even though we go through a lot of pessimism during these days, we can literally find some hope in these songs, even though they were kind of depressing. But literally, the music makes you feel and makes you just allow you to exist in these type of moments where you feel human when you experience the emotions that are in these songs. And he said, actively, we have woven ourselves with the very warp and woof of this nation. We fought their battles, shared their sorrow, mingled our blood with theirs, and generation after generation have pleaded with the headstrong, careless people to despise not justice, mercy, and truth, lest the nation be smitten with a curse. Our song, our toil, our cheer, and warning have been given to this nation and blood brotherhood. Are these gifts not worth saving? Is not this work and striving? Would America have been America without her Negro people? And literally, Black culture makes American culture. So it's literally like a lot of the inventions that we have today were invented by Black people, like the traffic lights, George Washington Carver's evolutionary things with the peanut butter and peanuts and stuff like that. Black women put one of the Armstrongs up into made a rocket so he can go into the moon and stuff like that. Like, we contributed so much to American society that it's to the point we need entitlement of everything. And that's it for the souls of Black folks. So for those of y'all don't know, I did create an Instagram for this whole thing. It's raisinsouls, as I said in the beginning of this video. So follow that. I'll probably put the @ in the description box below. And thank you for taking you on this journey. And go read Souls of Black Folk. I highly recommend it. A lot of African American studies programs read this book. And yeah, take care. Do what you have to do to love yourself. Get some black joy. And I'll see y'all next time. And any text y'all recommend, put them in the book, comment below. And